Hey guys, tonight we begin with something curious. You're standing in the low amber glow of a Victorian parlor, surrounded by dark oak furniture and a heavy, almost theatrical hush. There's the tick of a wall clock, the faint rustle of layered skirts. And then, suddenly, something moves. Not the grand piano, not the porcelain doll perched eerily on the bookshelf. No, it's something smaller, softer, coming from the folds of a woman's dress. The rustle is delicate, but unmistakable, like the skitter of paws across velvet. You lean in, trying not to seem rude, and there it is, a little twitch. A tiny pink nose peeks out of a carefully stitched pocket, followed by two round, whiskery ears. A mouse, a living mouse, in a pocket. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're offered a seat near the hearth beside a plate of crumpets no one seems interested in. All eyes are on the lady with the pocket. She doesn't seem the least bit alarmed that a rodent is now comfortably curled in the palm of her glove. In fact, she gives it a light scratch behind the ears and offers it a sunflower seed from a crystal dish on the tea table. This is not an accident. This is not a pest. This is a pocket mouse, and this is completely normal. At least in 1864 London. You blink. The mouse blinks back. Apparently, this isn't even the only mouse in the room. One girl in a saffron walking dress has a little gray companion, perched on her shoulder, nestled in the ruffles. Another is letting her mouse scurry across the piano keys, as if performing a miniature sonata. You learn quickly that in this particular circle of society, mice are not feared, they're favored. Petite, quiet, clean, and trainable. These carefully bred companions have become a charming accessory for ladies of a certain class. Tamer than ferrets, quieter than lapdogs, and far easier to conceal in social settings where modesty and propriety are still the law of the land. One mainstream account from the era written in a lady's lifestyle column naturally describes how a well-mannered lady of modern sensibility may carry upon her person no less than a half-dozen sweet-tempered mouselings. Whether that number was a typo or a dare remains unclear. You sip imaginary tea and glance around the room. A few gentlemen present, try not to stare, but it's obvious some are uncomfortable. One clears his throat with the force of someone suppressing an opinion. Another edges subtly away from a love seat that has recently become a mouse highway. But the ladies, they're glowing. giggling, comparing pocket stitching and miniature feeding spoons. One proudly shows off a mouse-sized bonnet she crocheted from silver thread and leftover lace trim. It's both ridiculous and somehow extremely stylish. You're handed a small scrap of cloth. It's soft, folded neatly, and inside it, a pale brown mouse, fast asleep, curled into a perfect comma. Its breathing is slow, serene. A tiny foot twitches. You're told his name is Sir Timothy, and that he enjoys waltzes and almonds, though never both at once. You cradle him like a secret. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or simply a fashionable anomaly among upper-crust eccentrics. Some claim it began as an offshoot of the broader pocket pet craze of the 1800s, which included squirrels, hedgehogs, and even turtles in handbags. Others suggest it had roots in older traditions of animal symbolism. Mice, after all, were associated with quiet virtue and domesticity in certain folkloric circles. But the Victorian pocket mouse, that was something else, something gentler, stranger, surprisingly intimate. And as the evening continues, you begin to understand why. These mice weren't just pets. They were confidants, companions, a comforting presence you could take with you through drawing rooms, dinner parties, and social obligations that required more posture than passion. No one could criticize a woman for being emotional over a dog, but a mouse in your pocket. That was a silent act of rebellion, wrapped in cuteness. One woman near the fire leans over to you and whispers, "He listens better than my husband." Then she offers the mouse a crumb and smiles. The fire pops. The mice shuffle. A lady yawns delicately and tucks her mouse back into the small velvet pocket stitched into her waistband. And you somehow don't find it strange anymore. You find it kind of wonderful. The next morning, you're woken not by alarm bells or clattering breakfast trays, but by the sound of tiny nails tapping against a lace glove. You blink against the buttery sunlight streaming through lace curtains and find yourself once again in the company of ladies and their mice. You're in a dressing room this time, warm with steam from the wash basin and scented with rosewater. A maid is folding linen underthings in the corner. A small white mouse scampers across a velvet stool, pausing now and then to sniff a thimble or investigate the seam of a boot. Today, you're properly introduced to the world of pocket mouse companionship. A woman in a teal corset and starched petticoat scoops up the tiny creature with practiced ease and places it in the palm of your hand. "This one's name is Gertrude," she says, with the sincerity of someone introducing a countess. She prefers lavender soap and warm milk in a porcelain thimble. You nod, as if this is completely expected. The mouse gazes up at you with deep, calm eyes. She's cleaner than most people you know, and it's no accident. Gertrude has been brushed gently with a toothbrush-sized comb and perfumed with a barely there floral mist. Her nails have been trimmed. Her whiskers are spotless. As you follow the morning rituals of this home, you begin to see that pocket mice aren't just tolerated, they're pampered. These ladies feed their mice fresh crumbs and bits of cream, offer them pockets lined with velvet and silk, and this is entirely serious. Sometimes compose lullabies for them. You're handed a journal. Inside are entries like Tuesday. Clara turned up her nose at Walnut. Wednesday. Learned to climb bonnet feathers. A triumph. Thursday. Bit cousin Henrietta. I'm secretly proud. Historians often debate the psychological reasons behind this trend. Was it loneliness? Was it rebellion in soft focus? Or was it simply the Victorian obsession with domestication, taken to a delightfully absurd degree? After all, this was an era of training ferns to grow symmetrically and naming pet owls things like Baron Nibblestone. Pocket mice fit the mold. Small, controlled, entirely adorable, and perhaps most importantly, easily hidden. You follow one woman. Miss Larkspur, her friends call her into her morning errands. As she steps outside, bonnet, perfectly angled gloves, delicately buttoned. No one would guess that a small gray blur is nestled just above her hip bone. Only the faintest tickle beneath her corset reminds her that Gertrude is still with her. The trick is placement, she whispers. Too low, and they tickle. Too high, and they panic. It's like a society game, an entire etiquette around the pocket mouse. She greets her neighbors with perfect grace. No one notices anything unusual, except for you and Gertrude, who peeks out briefly during a particularly dull conversation about flower beds, then slips back inside like a tiny gossip eavesdropper. As you walk the path toward the village post box, another woman in a saffron shawl leans down and whispers, "Mine likes poetry, especially Keats." Then she holds up a gloved hand, and there, poking from her cuff, is the smallest mouse you've seen yet. It yawns. Pocket mice, you realize, were a kind of shared secret among Victorian ladies. A little thrill, a little rebellion, a soft declaration. I may smile at your joke, but in my pocket, someone smarter is napping. Later back at the house, you help prepare a mouse's morning meal, crushed oat cake, and a dot of raspberry jam. The presentation is careful, almost ceremonial. A rosebud is placed beside the plate, not for scent, but for scale. You sit on a fainting couch, sipping pretend tea, and watch as 3 mice are returned to their designated pockets, each swaddled like a precious jewel. One curls up beneath a layer of lace. Another nestles near the waistband of a skirt. A third is slipped into a small linen pouch sewn directly into a sleeve. And you wonder, was it love? Was it mischief? Or maybe it was simply comfort. In an age of stiff collars, strict manners, and social rules, so endless they could smother a soul. A warm, purring heartbeat in your pocket might be the only softness you could carry with you. Gertrude agrees, snoring gently against a sachet of dried mint. The house is quiet now, except for the soft click of boots on parquet floors, and the occasional high-pitched squeak that escapes from someone's sleeve. You follow the sound into the drawing room, where sunlight filters through embroidered curtains and turns every dust mote into something sacred. This is not a place for noise. This is a place for status. You settle onto a chaise near a walnut writing desk and watch as the pocket mice reappear as if summoned by routine. They emerge slowly, one from a waistcoat lining one from the folds of a tea gown, another from a delicately embroidered muff. All are clean. All are alert. All are wearing tiny ribbons. You're in the company of mouse royalty now. A tall woman in a russet dress holds up a silver thimble like a goblet. Perched beside it on the edge of the table is her mouse, stiff with poise, and watching the room like a miniature monarch. This, she announces, is Her Grace Millicent of Whitchurch. Another nods solemnly. She once nibbled the fringe off a dowager's parasol. There's laughter, polite, delighted. The mouse remains stone-faced. You're handed a small leather-bound ledger containing the lineage of another mouse, Lord Whiskerly IV. He has, according to the chart, a distinguished bloodline of hand-reared mice going back at least 6 generations, including Sir Nutmeg of Devon and Lady Pip of the Hanging Fern. Historians still argue whether these pedigrees were serious or satirical. Was this the upper-class version of hobbyist whimsy? Or was it a sincere attempt at building social identity through rodents? Some scholars believe the records were maintained as social leverage. If your mouse came from a recognized line, it said something about your refinement. Others suspect it was more about bonding over absurdity in a world full of rules. You turn the page and find a list of mouse titles awarded in the past week. Most graceful exit from a pocket, at best whisker shine, to quietest lap sitter, evening. Tea division, it's ridiculous. It's perfect. You walk over to a low table where a group of young women are constructing a makeshift throne from sugar cubes and lace scraps. One of the mice, an especially dapper brown fellow, with a gold thread tied gently around his neck, is crowned with a paper halo. "Sir Crumbington," someone whispers, reverently. His ears twitch. The ladies applaud. Pocket mice aren't just accessories anymore. They're celebrities. They have reputations, personalities, even rivalries. You overhear one girl mutter that her mouse Winifred refuses to share a couch with Millicent because of what happened at the music recital. You don't ask. Instead, you help prepare a mouse banquet. A handkerchief laid flat topped with a pile of biscuit crumbs, a line of soaked bread crust, and what looks suspiciously like a sugar-dusted currant. The mice eat delicately, paws together, eyes bright. One sits on a teaspoon like it's a throne, and through it all, the humans keep talking about embroidery, about husbands, about inheritance laws, but always with half a mind on the mice. One hand stirring tea, the other gently petting a head no larger than a coin. You begin to understand that pocket mice served a particular purpose in this world. Not just amusement, not just rebellion. They were a symbol of composure. A lady who could control a mouse in her pocket while hosting 10 guests and pouring tea without spilling. That was grace incarnate. And in a society where women were expected to be composed at all times, perhaps it helped to keep something nearby that was entirely uncomposed. A creature that twitched, squeaked, darted into shadows, and occasionally stole ribbon. A reminder that chaos still lived in lace. That afternoon, as the ladies gather in the garden, the mice are carefully retrieved from their pockets and gently placed on linen doilies spread over the grass. One mouse tries to escape into a flower bed. Two ladies dive after it at once, giggling like schoolgirls' gloves flying. The mouse, of course, gets away. It's caught beneath a watering can by a maid who says nothing, only hands it back with a practiced smile. Sir Crumbington is returned to his thimble. Millicent grooms her ears unbothered. And you sit beneath the shade of a willow tree, watching a woman in indigo silk whisper poetry to a mouse in her sleeve. You awaken to the rhythmic click of sewing scissors and the soft swish of fabric being laid flat. The parlor has transformed overnight. Gone are the lounging ladies and parading mice. This morning, it's a tailoring studio, and the subject is serious. You're here to help create a mouse pocket. Not just any pocket, of course, a bespoke, velvet-lined, satin-trimmed miniature suite designed for the comfort and concealment of a very specific companion, a black and white mouse named Algernon. known for his dislike of loud noises and his fondness for hiding in tea cozies. A young woman in a teal day dress explains the plan as she pins a scrap of embroidered muslin to her sleeve. It must be secure enough to contain him, but not so tight that he sulks, she says. Last week, he refused to come out for hours. You nod solemnly. These are high-stakes logistics. The sewing begins, and you're swept into a quiet flurry of delicate tasks. One woman cuts narrow strips of velvet. Another threads gold-streaked silk through a bone needle. You're assigned to stuffing the lining with a whisper of lamb's wool, soft enough to cradle a mouse, firm enough to hold its shape. The result is a tiny opulent chamber with a drawstring closure and a hook sewn directly into the underside of a corset's waist seam. Function and fashion, hand in glove. Victorian clothing, after all, was full of secret structures, hidden petticoat loops, sewn-in handkerchief cases, even tear catchers in sleeve hems. So why not a mouse? Pocket. Historians still debate whether these accessories were widespread or isolated to a few eccentric circles. Some surviving garments do feature irregular interior stitching that might have held more than coin or scent sachets. One theory suggests mouse pockets evolved from the stomachers of earlier eras, decorative panels that concealed layers of fabric and apparently small rodents. You help pin the pocket into the lining of a walking dress. Its location is key close to the natural curve of the hip, where body heat keeps the mouse warm, but pressure is minimal. The pocket must be deep enough to allow resting, shallow enough to prevent entrapment. It's practically an art form. Once finished, Algernon is gently lowered into his new quarters. He sniffs, spins, and promptly falls asleep. Success. Other women follow suit. One adds a lace flap for privacy. Another installs a loop for a bell so he may summon me if he tires. It's unclear whether she's joking. Later, you're taken on a tour of mouse fashion enhancements. There's a velvet reticule. Technically, a purse converted into a mobile mouse theater with drawbridge cushion and tiny book of poems glued shut for nibble resistance. There's a fan with a hidden fold where a mouse can nap between performances. There's even a glove with a mouse-sized sleeve stitched along the forearm for dramatic reveals, the owner explains, with a wink. One lady stands proudly before a mirror as her maid tucks her mouse beneath her bustle. He likes the sway, she says, and he's far less judgmental than a chaperone. You try not to laugh. In the garden, the walking mice make their debut. You accompany two ladies down a gravel path, their dresses rustling with every step, tiny pink noses peeking now and then from folds of russet and indigo. It's like a secret society moving through the hedgerows with elegance and mischief. One mouse scampers a bit too far and must be retrieved from beneath a rosebush with a biscuit bribe. Another is carried home in a bonnet after a disagreement with a beetle. You help dust off his whiskers and return him to his pocket, safely swaddled in cambric. Back inside the pocket is unfastened, smoothed, and refolded for later use. Algernon peers out, yawns wide enough to show all his tiny teeth, then curls into a perfect spiral. He is, without question, the best-dressed creature in the room. And you begin to realize these pockets weren't just containers. They were crafted declarations, tailored spaces of affection, creativity, and quiet companionship in a world of rigid seams and stitched tight rules. Even in a society of corsets and conduct books, it turns out there was still room for softness. The parlor is bustling again, but today there's something in the air. Not perfume, not powdered starch. No, this scent is unmistakable. Honey cakes, raspberry cordial, and a faint, unmistakable note of mouse fur. You've been invited to something rarely witnessed, even in this strange chapter of history. A mouse party. The sun streams through stained glass panels as tables are arranged along the conservatory windows, each covered in embroidered linens and set with porcelain saucers no bigger than a button. On them, crumbs, dabs of jam, and what appears to be a single candied violet balanced atop a slice of sugar toast. You're handed a folded card with cursive lettering. Miss Petunia Flitch requests your presence at the afternoon mouse. Tea. 2 o'clock sharp. Formal whiskers required. Of course. The guests arrive slowly. Ladies in saffron, teal, and russet, each bearing a mouse tucked gently in a sleeve muff or the folds of a bonnet. You spot Gertrude, again, eyes bright, already investigating the centerpiece with barely restrained curiosity. Each mouse is placed on a tiny cushion or satin square and offered a selection of sweets. Crumbs are delicately arranged in pyramids. Teacups, thimble-sized, contain drops of milk or sugared water. It is both completely absurd and utterly enchanting. One woman, her mouse perched on a teaspoon like a royal steed, stands to make a toast. To dainty paws and quiet company, she declares. The room erupts in polite applause. You are seated beside a woman whose mouse Penelope wears a hat, not a metaphorical hat, a real one, crocheted with care and fitted with a loop of ribbon under the chin. Penelope is by all accounts dignified. She sips her thimble milk and does not beg. You suspect she is the unofficial queen of the occasion. over the course of the next hour, you observe a mouse dragging an entire scone crumb across a table, as another falling asleep inside a sugar bowl, and two mice engaged in what appears to be a polite disagreement over a candied nut and the humans. They are utterly charmed. It's more than a game. It's a ritual, a soft rebellion against the world outside this room, where women are expected to be composed, quiet, and ever watchful of propriety. But here they are caretakers of something tiny and free. Historians who stumble upon diary entries and sketchbooks from this period often assume exaggeration, but there are surviving invitations, miniature place settings, even recipes adjusted for small mouths and strong teeth. A curious 1883 article describes a tea hosted by a lady in Hampshire with dozens of rodents in satin collars. Whether that's literal or fanciful, no one agrees, but you now believe it entirely. Halfway through the event, a game begins, the sugar hunt. A single currant is hidden beneath one of the teacups. The mice are set loose, gently encouraged by the tapping of teaspoons. They scurry, sniff, and explore. Penelope finds it first. Naturally, she is rewarded with applause and a dot of jam. A younger lady, barely more than a girl, whispers that her mouse once played the piano. When pressed, she clarifies, "He ran across the keys while I practiced scales." But he was quite rhythmic. You nod. Impressive. Eventually, the mice grow drowsy. One curls up on a silk napkin and begins to snore. Another hides behind a jam jar and refuses to emerge. The sun tilts lower. Conversations soften. A breeze drifts in through the conservatory, rustling lace curtains and stirring the candle flames. You sit quietly, watching a mouse nap beside a sugar cube shaped like a rose. A hand lays gently across yours. Its owner, smiling mouse, asleep in her pocket. "There's something about them," she says. They listen without interrupting. You agree. As the guests gather their mice and begin to leave, slowly, carefully, with whispered goodbyes, you realize you've witnessed something both completely ridiculous and profoundly human. Because sometimes even the smallest tea party leaves the warmest impression. It's dusk now, and the parlor has dimmed to that soft amber hush reserved for after-dinner hours. Lamps have been lit. A fire crackles lazily. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone is preparing a bowl of milk and oats, not for the guests, but for the mice. You find yourself in the drawing room again, this time beside a tall bookcase filled not with novels, but with tiny brass nameplates, each one engraved with a mouse's name. Lord Whiskerly, Lady Button, Pip Fennel, Sir Nibbleton, the Brave, and next to each, a small sketch lovingly inked in fine strokes. A curled body. Here. A dashing pose there. One in a ribbon, another tucked into the pocket of a lace glove. A woman in a saffron housecoat is standing at the mantel, reciting from memory the full title and lineage of her mouse, as though introducing an ambassador. Lord Cedric Thistlewhisk of the Mayfair line, direct descendant of Minerva the Swift, and heir to the waistcoat buttonhole. You're not sure whether to applaud or curtsy. This is where you begin to see just how elaborate the world of pocket mice has become. Some mice have titles. Others have homes, miniature dollhouses, complete with staircases and fainting couches. One woman shows you a tiny chaise upholstered in crimson silk. He enjoys reclining, she says, as if speaking of a tiny duke. We never disturb him before noon. Historians have found fragments of these mouse estates in estate sales and attic trunks, handmade, crafted with shocking precision, right down to framed portraits on the walls. One even included a functional, mouse-sized wardrobe. You're invited into what can only be described as a rodent salon. The room is filled with plush cushions, low tables, and shallow dishes of water, scented faintly with chamomile. The mice, 5 or 6 of them, move freely across the rug, their steps soft and practiced. No one chases them. No one flinches. This is their realm, and the women in the room, their admiring court. In the corner, someone plays a gentle tune on a harp. One mouse climbs a pillow and stares as though contemplating art. You're handed a small bundle. It's a mouse grooming kit. Inside, a miniature comb, a toothpick-sized brush, and a pot of something labeled whisker balm. You watch as one lady dabs a speck of balm onto her mouse's face. It keeps the fur glossy, and he enjoys the attention. Nearby, a woman is teaching her mouse to twirl. She does this by placing a dried petal on the floor and gently guiding the mouse in a circle with the tip of a feather. It twirls, then bows, then sits expectantly. 3 weeks, she says proudly. Not everyone trains theirs. Some mice are just companions. One girl has embroidered a pouch with her mouse's initials GT and tucks him into it each night with a whispered story. You're beginning to understand something vital. This isn't just about novelty. It's about ritual. It's about creating softness in a world that often doesn't allow it. These women live in corsets, measured glances, and constant etiquette. But they're mice. They are tiny rebels. They sniff, squeak, scurry, and occasionally chew important lace. And no one punishes them for it. In fact, they are celebrated for it. The fire pops. One mouse scurries onto your lap, sniffs your sleeve, then dashes back toward a small velvet chaise. You smile a little, surprised that it doesn't feel strange anymore. One of the older women leans close. "He likes you," she says. "He can tell." You ask how? She smiles. Mice know softness. You stay long after the harp stops, after the lamplight grows dim, and the mice have curled up in pouches, pockets, and thimble cradles. The fire glows low. A clock ticks gently, and as you leave the room, you glance back one last time at Lord Cedric Thistlewisk, now asleep beside a sugar cube, a speck of balm on his brow, perfectly regal, perfectly ridiculous, perfectly loved. It's mid-morning, and you find yourself once again amid the rustling silks and polished boots of another grand Victorian home. Only this one has a distinctly mischievous air. The rugs have been rolled back. The piano bench has been tipped on its side. A biscuit tin is open on the floor. Something is happening. You're in the midst of a mouse incident. The first clue is the laughter, muffled, controlled, but bubbling just under the surface. The second is the cluster of women hunched near the fireplace, whispering and pointing behind a stack of books. The third is the low groan of someone who has clearly surrendered to the chaos. I told her not to bring 3. A woman mutters, peering into a boot. You're just in time to witness the charming spectacle of pocket mice gone rogue. It starts when a mouse named Prudence, small and white, with a black patch over one eye, escapes from her designated cardigan lining and darts beneath a piano. She is quickly followed by Cornelius, a known instigator, and a third unnamed mouse, whose only identifying feature is an oversized pink bow and a complete lack of fear. 3 mice, dozens of hiding spots, 0 shame. The search party is formed immediately. Gentlewomen on all fours, lifting up hat boxes and peering behind tea trays, calling out names like they're summoning lost pets or very tiny guests who have overstayed their welcome. One mouse is spotted climbing a tassel. Another disappears into the folds of a heavily embroidered curtain. A third is nearly scooped into a reticule, along with a lemon tart. You, of course, are asked to help. You crawl under a settee and find Cornelius triumphantly perched atop a forgotten embroidery hoop. He grooms himself and then stares at you as if daring you to catch him. Eventually, all 3 fugitives are recovered. Cornelius in the sewing basket, Prudence in a boot, and the pink-bowed escape artist inside a sugar bowl. She emerges covered in icing and entirely unrepentant. You help clean her off with a cloth dipped in rose water. She licks your thumb. One of the ladies laughs, well, better than the corset incident. You raise an eyebrow. She grins. He chewed clean through a lace tie mid-waltz. The scandal was exquisite. Historians acknowledge that mice weren't always perfectly behaved. There are period accounts, some reliable, some suspiciously theatrical, of pocket mice disrupting dinner parties, vanishing during carriage rides, and once famously appearing at the hem of a bishop's robe during a christening. In private, of course, these mishaps were adored. In public, they were tolerated, just barely. You're told about the time a mouse leapt from a bonnet mid-curtsy and landed in a gentleman's teacup. It swam calmly. He fainted. Another story involves a mouse who had learned to climb buttons and performed a dramatic pirouette at the top of a governess's bodice during a Sunday sermon. And then there's the tale of one adventurous rodent who tunneled through an opera glove, causing its wearer to shriek, toss her hand skyward, and strike an unsuspecting baron on the chin. The mouse was uninjured. The baron was smitten. Whether or not these tales are embroidered over time, you begin to see how pocket mice brought unpredictability into a society obsessed with control. A little case tucked into a bodice, a little wildness inside a lace glove, and the women, they relished it. As the afternoon wanes, the mice are tucked back into their rightful spots. The parlor is reassembled. A new tin of biscuits is opened, this one mouse-proofed, with a buttoned cloth cover. You sit near the window, watching as Prudence, now fully recovered from her adventure, pokes her nose out of a gingham pouch and yawns. She curls into a ball, sighs, and closes her eyes. Beside her, the woman in the saffron shawl murmurs, "She only runs when she's bored. Just like me." You look at the pair of them, one curled in fabric, the other holding her like treasure. And you can't help but smile, because in a world full of schedules, manners, and drawn-tight corset strings, sometimes the most important moments are the ones when a mouse breaks loose. The garden party begins under a sky so politely overcast it might have been arranged by committee. You stand beneath a trellis, wrapped in pale wisteria, watching as ladies in layered pastels drift across the lawn like blossoms blown from a wallpaper pattern. Everything is immaculate, silver spoons aligned on linen doilies, teacups chiming faintly on saucers, tiny sandwiches cut with terrifying precision. And still, you know what everyone's truly here to see: the mice. Today, they're not hidden in pockets or muffled sleeves. Today, they are stars. One woman, tall, elegant, with a mouse the color of Earl Grey perched on her shoulder, nods to you, as if to say, yes, this is completely normal. The mouse peers down at you, then delicately begins grooming her ear, utterly unbothered by the audience. Across the garden, a girl in a ribboned bonnet opens her reticule, and out steps a tiny russet mouse who stretches yawns and then promptly hops onto a nearby biscuit. A small gasp, a ripple of laughter. The mouse is gently retrieved and rewarded with a flake of scone. You drift past parasols and polished shoes, overhearing snippets of conversation. Of course I let her sit at table. She's cleaner than my brother. I believe Edith's mouse attended finishing school. Look at that posture. And whispered behind a lace fan. I heard one girl kept 2 in a bustle. Imagine the rustling. You find yourself beside a tea cart where a woman in indigo lifts her cup without looking, and a mouse, with the timing of a magician, pokes his head out from the rim and sneezes. She smiles, lowers the cup, and casually offers him a sugared petal. It's as if they've rehearsed it. Still, not everyone is charmed. You hear murmurs from the older guests, those who see this trend as distasteful, improper too, French, or simply a danger to furniture. One aunt, in severe black, tuts loudly as a mouse peeks from a purse. This is what happens when young women read poetry. Another warns of disease. She is eating ham with her fingers. A few gentlemen try to look disapproving, but keep stealing glances toward the mice. One seems to be sketching one discreetly on the back of his calling card. Historians note that the social reception of pocket mice was mixed depending on geography and generation. In some circles, they were a sign of delicate eccentricity, a fashionable affectation, like lavender gloves, or speaking faint German. In others, they were scandalous, suggestive of rural upbringing or worse imagination. The debate, of course, only made the mice more popular. You watch a small group of girls form a circle under a cherry tree and set out a miniature picnic: toasted crumbs, slivers of cheese, a drop of marmalade on a silver button. Their mice gather politely. One tugs at a violet petal until it rips in half. He looks pleased with himself. Then suddenly, drama. A mouse, possibly startled by a gust of wind or the unscheduled opening of a parasol, makes a break for it. He scurries across the lawn like a fuzzy little thunderbolt, dodging slippers and chair legs. A chase ensues, quick, breathless, entirely unladylike. You run too. Eventually, the fugitive is cornered near the rose trellis, snatched up gently, and returned to the safety of a waistcoat pocket. There is applause. A few pretend to swoon. One mouse observing the scene from atop a custard tart, looks vaguely judgmental. The afternoon winds down with a recitation. A girl with a tremble in her voice reads a poem she's written to her mouse. Though society may sneer, you whisper close and draw me near. No bonnet judge, nor corset tight, can match your tale's quiet delight. There's polite clapping, a few sniffles. One mouse sneezes and is passed a petal as a handkerchief. As guests gather their things and mice vanish once again into folds of linen and lace, you realize this garden party was not about showing off. Not really. It was about sharing the secret. That inside every petticoat, every carefully constructed smile, every stitched-up rule of society, there's room for a mouse. The house is dim and heavy with elands, the kind that falls after laughter has gone, and the tea has gone cold. Rain taps at the window panes like a polite intruder, and someone in the next room sighs over a letter that's been read too many times. You follow the quiet down the corridor, past wallpaper blooming with faded roses, and into a small sitting room where the curtains are drawn and the clock ticks too loudly. Here the mood is different. A single candle flickers on a low table. Beside it, a small coffin, no longer than a hairbrush, rests on a folded lace handkerchief. It is lined in velvet. A ribbon is tied neatly around it. A mouse has died. You sit beside a woman in mourning black jet beads, glinting against the candlelight gloves folded in her lap. Her eyes are red, but her expression is calm. On the table before her is a tiny sprig of thyme, a scrap of sugar, biscuit, and what appears to be a thimble filled with violets. This is a pocket mouse funeral. It is both completely absurd and impossibly tender. The gathered mourners are quiet. Each carries a token, a scrap of lace, a pressed flower, a drawing, a poem. One girl holds a lock of fur wrapped in silk. Another has brought a dish with the deceased's favorite crumb. The mouse's name, you're told, was Henrietta. She was fond of climbing into bodices and once learned to ring a bell by tugging a thread tied to a curtain. You feel the heaviness in the room, not melodrama, but genuine grief. These mice weren't just ornaments or distractions. They were companions. For many of these women, the only ones who listened without judgment or vanished without explanation. Someone begins to read, "In silken folds she softly slept, a velvet heart, a secret kept. Though small in form, she walked with grace and brought wild joy to every place." A sob is quickly stifled. The coffin is lifted with care and carried to the garden. Rain has let up, leaving the soil soft and sweet-smelling. A tiny spade is used. The coffin is lowered. A handful of petals scattered. No cross, just a stone carved with a single initial H. You help set a tiny wreath beside it, fashioned from baby's breath and thread. Historians rarely mention these ceremonies. Most records have vanished, whispered away in footnotes, or dismissed as overly sentimental, but a few references remain. Drawings of thimble-sized gravestones, poems tucked in journals, and one letter describing a mouse resting beside the lilies with better dignity than half the men I've known. You return inside where the mood begins to shift. Someone stokes the fire. A tray of warm bread is passed around, and from a muff near the hearth, a small gray mouse stirs, stretches, and blinks at the world. Clarabelle, her owner, murmurs, "We are not alone." The others begin to share stories. Of the mouse who stole a button and hid it in a piano. Of the one who chewed a hole through a governess's slippers and was forgiven entirely. Of the pair who once danced, yes, danced on the lid of a music box as though choreographed. You're handed a cup of warm milk with nutmeg. The room is soft again. The ache still lingers, but it's lighter now, made bearable by memory, by ritual, by mice who nibbled their way into hearts otherwise armored with etiquette and starch. One girl leans her head against her mother's shoulder. "I think I'll sew her name into my dress hem," she says. "She'll travel with you," her mother replies. And you realize something deeply Victorian mourning isn't just about sorrow. It's about continuing, quietly, softly, even through seams and sleeves and velvet-lined pockets. Clarabelle yawns and disappears into her owner's glove. The candle flickers low, and the smallest grave in the garden holds a love as vast as any cathedral's. The day begins in a cluttered upstairs room, warm with the scent of sawdust, honeyed tea, and ambition. The windows are flung wide, letting in the morning air, and the floor is scattered with bits of ribbon, paper, spools, tiny hoops, and several very enthusiastic mice. Welcome to the Mouse Circus. More specifically, a homegrown training ground overseen by Miss Puddlewick, a retired governess with silver hair, sharp eyes, and the voice of someone who once taught Latin to boys who absolutely did not want to learn Latin. Today, though, her students are furred and far more cooperative. You arrive just as she's guiding a mouse named Tansy across a narrow bridge fashioned from a ruler, balanced between two teacups. "Feet, close tail light," she murmurs. "Grace, not speed." Tansy, a sleek black mouse with a dab of white over her eye, tiptoes across like a seasoned performer. At the end of the bridge, she's rewarded with a flake of biscuit and a round of polite applause. The room hums with energy. One corner features a looped ribbon tunnel, another a miniature seesaw. A third contains a set of 6 stacked thimbles, which a mouse named Casper is attempting to climb, pausing only to scratch his chin thoughtfully. Miss Puddlewick waves you over. "They're artists," she says proudly. "Athletes, thinkers, dreamers. I only help them express it." You're handed a training stick, a carved toothpick, really, and tasked with teaching a mouse to hop over a sewing bobbin. It takes 4 tries and 1 unplanned detour into your sleeve, but eventually the mouse clears the jump. The room cheers softly. Historians largely ignore this subculture of Victorian rodent performance, dismissing it as parlor whimsy or eccentric womanly nonsense. But scattered evidence remains matchbox-sized props, playbills, printed in delicate ink, and one oil painting depicting a mouse balancing on a silver spoon while wearing what appears to be a monocle. Miss Puddlewick once toured the countryside with her mouse acrobats, performing in drawing rooms, church fairs, and even once scandalously at a gentleman's club, where the mice were better received than the wine. She shows you her photo album, black and white images of mice jumping through rings, pushing buttons, and balancing on teacup handles. In one, she poses in a cape, holding a mouse like a scepter. "Fleur de fromage," she says fondly. "Could dance to Mendelssohn. Had perfect timing," you smile. She doesn't. She was brilliant. Training is not just physical, it's emotional. The mice are taught to trust, to respond to tone, to recognize their names and their roles. One mouse. Basil rings a tiny bell on cue. Another nudges a spool across the table with measured dignity. There are rehearsals. There are costumes. One mouse wears a single epaulette made from ribbon and a gold sequin. Another has a cape fashioned from a scrap of old hymn book. You help prepare the stage, a small table covered in brocade, lined with thread spools and framed by lace curtains. A thimble serves as the spotlight. A loop of brass forms the arch. The show begins. A trumpet is mimicked with a comb and paper. The first mouse crosses a tightrope of ribbon. The second pushes a button with his nose to release a paper flag. The third climbs a spoon and performs what Miss Puddlewick calls a dignified descent. Applause, laughter, a single tear from a woman in the second row. You glance around and realize something important. The audience isn't just amused. They're moved. This isn't a joke. It's a joy. A celebration of precision patience and the triumph of the very small. Later, as the mice nap in their matchbox beds, Miss Puddlewick sips her tea and leans close. People think we train them for tricks, she says. But really, we train ourselves to pay attention. You nod. Outside, the rain begins again, tapping gently at the window. Inside, the tiny stage stands empty, lit by candlelight. A single spool has tipped on its side, and somewhere beneath a velvet cloth, a mouse dreams of applause. The next morning dawns gray and resolute, with a stiff breeze that tugs at parasols and rearranges bonnets, whether they like it or not. You're walking down a cobbled street beside a woman in a sharply tailored coat, her boots clicking with purpose. No frills today, no lace, gloves. Her mouse rides quietly in the breast pocket, nose just peeking out beneath a folded handkerchief. This is not a party. This is a march. You're with Miss Imogen Clary, a suffragette social reformer, and perhaps, surprisingly, a devoted mousekeeper. But she doesn't keep her mouse for whimsy or fashion. She carries him for strength. He's not a mascot, she says. He's a witness. The mouse, a pale gray male with one bent ear, is called Ernest. He's been with her through protests, pamphleteering, and one unfortunate run-in with a minister who did not appreciate rodents or reform. You trail her through the narrow alleyways of East London, past soot-dark buildings and soot-darker stairs. She pins notices to fences, slips leaflets into doorways, speaks to shop girls and maids with quick, sure words. The mouse never leaves her side. Historians rarely mention women like Imogen Clary. The official record favors speeches and signatures, not sleeve-bound mice. But personal letters, journal entries, and a single satirical cartoon from 1896 confirm the truth. More than a few reformers carried mice not as distractions, but as anchors. For women marching into hostile streets, shouted at by strangers shamed in the press. A mouse in the pocket was not softness, it was stillness. Imogen explains it simply. He reminds me to breathe. You walk with her into a tiny community hall tucked behind a bakery. Inside, women gather on mismatched chairs beneath gaslight sconces, their hands ink-smudged, their expressions set. Tea is passed. Plans are made. And mice are there too. One now inside a satchel near the coat rack. Another peers out from a pocket watch case lined with velvet. No one points. No one asks. They are companions, says a young woman in spectacles. Better than husbands. Calmer than dogs. And always present. The meeting begins. The agenda is brisk, new pamphlet. Language upcoming rallies. One member, fined for disorderly conduct involving a sandwich board and a bishop's nephew. Laughter flickers briefly, then fades. You notice Ernest climb a little higher in Imogen's pocket. He listens. You can tell. At one point, the woman leading the meeting chokes on her words. Her hand shakes as she lifts her teacup. From the shadows of her sleeve, a tiny paw appears. She steadies. You begin to understand. These mice are not decorations. They are co-conspirators. After the meeting, you help fold flyers and tuck them into oilskin envelopes. Ernest helps too, by sitting firmly atop the pile so the wind doesn't steal them. You ask Imogen if she's ever worried about him getting hurt. She pauses. No more than I worry about myself, she says. But he's always careful. And braver than most of Parliament, you walk her home by lamplight, the air sharp with coal smoke and change. She stops once to offer her last flyer to a baker's daughter, then continues, without comment. When you part ways at her gate, Ernest lifts his head slightly, as if to nod. Back in your own borrowed room, you sit on the edge of a cot and think about how many battles are fought quietly, how many rebellions are folded in pockets, how many revolutions are whispered, not shouted, and how one little mouse with a bent ear and a biscuit crumb might carry more courage than 100 flags. The seasons have begun to turn. The air carries the crisp edge of late autumn, and the gardens have gone brittle and brown, crunching underfoot like parchment. You find yourself back in the city, inside a narrow townhouse with high ceilings and cold floors, where a familiar rustle greets you near the coat stand. The mice are still here, but something's changing. You follow a younger girl, Lydia, dressed in a plain house frock and stained apron, into a sitting room where a once proud chaise now wears a threadbare blanket, and the sugar bowl is conspicuously empty. The pocket she pats gently at her waist holds a mouse, but today it's not trimmed in velvet or lined in lace. Cotton scraps, she says. Much easier to wash. You nod, and she shrugs. Things are tighter now. You've stepped into a world of pocket mice in decline. It's not dramatic, not tragic, just quiet, gradual disappearance. As Edwardian styles rise, straighter lines, tighter corsets, fewer folds. There's simply less room for softness. Quite literally. The older dresses, with their voluminous skirts and secret hollows, are giving way to sleeker silhouettes and busier days. Women are working more walking, farther, carrying less. There's talk of telephones, typewriters, bicycles, the age of the mouse, as a statement, a comfort, a companion, is slowly fading. but not everywhere. Lydia introduces you to her grandmother, a stiff, regal woman who used to host tea parties for no one under 2 feet tall. Now she sits in a sun-drenched corner of the kitchen, mending socks with thick thread and a magnifying glass. Her mouse Bran is white aging and missing a whisker. He naps beside a cup of warm milk and a tea bag. We don't have the parties anymore, she says, but we still talk. Historians sometimes point to 1903 as the year mousekeeping fell out of fashion entirely. Others argue it lingered in rural homes and eccentric salons until the First World War, when it all vanished under wool uniforms and ration books. But what no one disputes is that it ended softly. There were no headlines, no last grand performance, just fewer pockets, fewer ribbons. A little more silence where Squeaks once lived. You help Lydia tidy the sitting room. She shows you a drawer where she keeps old mouse items, a thimble leash, a crumpled miniature bonnet, a recipe card with crumb cakes for Pip scrawled in careful cursive. The ink is faded. The memory is not. Later, you take a walk through the neighborhood. You notice that no one wears bustle dresses anymore. The silhouettes are sharper, the movement brisker. The pockets, if present at all, are stitched into straight lines, practical, impersonal, and mouse-proof. You pass one woman who, seeing Bran peek from Lydia's apron, raises an eyebrow, not in horror, but in bemused nostalgia. "I had one once," she says. "Named him Thistle. Lost him to a window box full of lavender. Never came back. Smart fellow." You stop by a park bench sitting beside a tree that's dropped half its leaves in a perfect golden circle. Bran curls in Lydia's hand, blinking at the afternoon light. "He's slower now," she says. "Doesn't climb like he used to." You nod. The wind picks up. Lydia folds her shawl tighter. The mouse tucks in further, his ears flattening against her palm. He's old, but still curious, still warm. Back at the house, Lydia places him in a small cloth hammock suspended from the window latch. He rocks gently as the sun sets behind glass, casting him in honey-colored light. He closes his eyes. You imagine he dreams of curtain tassels and biscuit crumbs. And you understand something clearly now. Just because a trend fades doesn't mean it's forgotten. The mice lived on, not in pockets or parlor shows, but in stories, in half-remembered poems, in sketches tucked between the pages of recipe books, in odd thimbles found in attics still faintly smelling of mint. You stand quietly in the hallway as Bran's hammock sways, and Lydia hums a lullaby that doesn't need words. You wake to the sound of footsteps across tile and the familiar clink of a teacup. But this time, it isn't lace or laughter waiting beyond the door. It's the smell of starch, iron polish, and an unfamiliar quiet. You've come to a house without mice. Not forever. Just not anymore. The parlor here is neat in that stiff, almost sterile way that speaks of good breeding and forgotten comfort. Cushions sit untouched. A book rests open to a page no one's read in weeks. There's no rustling in the curtains, no tiny shape curled on the windowsill. But on the mantel, framed in silver, is a small sketch. A mouse. Simple, graceful mid-leap. The lines are soft. The initials beneath read MG. You're greeted by Eleanor, the middle daughter of a family you've not yet met. She's dressed simply in a wool skirt and a blouse with a modest collar. Her movements are efficient, but her voice holds warmth. "My sister kept a mouse," she says, leading you into the sitting room. She called her Matilda. We thought it was silly at first. The way she says "at first" speaks volumes. You sit beside her as she opens a drawer in the writing desk and produces a journal. Its pages are filled with looped handwriting and tiny paw prints. She'd let her walk across the page as she wrote. Said it helped her think. You smile. Of course she did. The pages document everything, from cream preferences to curtain-climbing accidents. In between, you find verses gentle, whimsical, some with sadness tucked between rhymes. She hides in hems and linen folds, her secrets soft, her courage bold. When silence grows too loud to bear, I find her curled beside my care. Eleanor closes the book and places it in your lap. She passed last winter. Matilda, too. There's a pause, just the ticking of a clock that has survived 4 generations, and one very determined mouse who used to nap behind its face. You walk together to the garden. The grass is brittle with frost. Near a patch of lavender sits a stone smaller than your hand, with an engraving nearly worn away. You kneel beside it. There's a faded ribbon tied to a twig planted near the base. A mouse-sized marker. A memory. She used to tuck Matilda in her sleeve when she was sad, Eleanor says. Said the weight was like a pebble, real enough to hold her here. Historians often miss this part of the story. The quiet after the fashion ends. The echoes in the rooms once filled with movement and warmth. The humans left behind still holding on to thimbles and tiny scrapbooks, unsure how to explain why an animal so small made a life so full. You return indoors, where Eleanor sets out a tray of shortbread and 2 china cups She pours your tea and places a folded napkin where Matilda would have sat. Habit, she says, and doesn't explain further. As twilight settles into the corners of the room, you begin to notice remnants. A mouse-sized staircase carved into the leg of a cabinet. A shallow dish still resting on a windowsill. A teacup with a perfect chew mark on the rim. None of it's been cleaned away. You sit quietly and let the warmth steep through your fingers. The house is still. The air is cool, but it doesn't feel empty. It feels remembered. Later, Eleanor leads you to the hall and presses a small object into your hand. A patch of velvet worn at the edges, faintly lavender-scented, lined in faded silk. It's a pocket, once sewn into a dress. You look at her. She nods. You'll know what to do. It's morning again, and you're in a different house now, one filled with gentle clutter and the smell of dried herbs and ink. This one belongs to a widow named Mrs. Finch, who answers the door wearing spectacles and slippers and carries a cane tipped with brass. She used to keep mice. She doesn't anymore, but she keeps their stories. The walls are lined with shelves, not of books, but of little memory boxes. Dozens of them, each one labeled with a name: Pip, Thistle, Marigold, Tuppence. Inside, mementos. A whisker, a scrap of ribbon, a drawing, a biscuit flake preserved in wax paper. I didn't start out intending to remember everything, she says, shuffling across the room to a low table. But they kept giving me reasons. She opens a box marked Fern. Inside a tiny wooden brush, a photograph, a poem written in smudged ink. The mouse in the photograph is perched on a saucer, her ears enormous, her eyes full of mischief. She stole my spectacles, once Mrs. Finch says, dragged them into a boot. Took me 2 hours to find them. Smart as a whip. Knew she'd made me laugh. You sit with her as she lights a small stove and sets out tea. The teacups are mismatched, the biscuits slightly stale. But it's perfect, because this is where the mice live now. Not in pockets, not in parlor games, but in the retelling, in the way her fingers pause on a locket, the way her voice dips when she says the name Hobnob. One of the boxes contains a tiny chair, whittled wood, hand-painted cushions, a theater seat for a mouse who once sat beside her every evening while she read David Copperfield aloud. He always fell asleep by chapter 3, she says, beaming. Historians rarely capture memory keepers like Mrs. Finch. They capture the grand, the loud, the documented. But these rooms, these boxes, they are archives of affection, of 100 ordinary moments made extraordinary because someone noticed. She shows you a faded invitation from a long-ago tea party, tiny script, postage stamp, sized envelope, RSVP, written in gold ink. They all came, she says, eyes far away. Even a few who swore it was nonsense. They wore their nicest gloves. You sip your tea and listen as she tells you of Fig, who climbed up her skirt and refused to come down for the vicar's entire visit. Of Clementine, who could untie a bonnet ribbon in under 30 seconds. Of Barnabas, who was buried in a pocket square, folded 12 times. He was very dignified, she adds. There's a quilt draped over the back of her chair. At first, it looks like a patchwork of florals and stripes. But then you see it. In every square, a mouse, embroidered in thread, some with names, some with tiny accessories, a book, a spoon, a feather hat. I make one for each, she says. Keeps my fingers busy, keeps them close. As the kettle whistles again, she lifts the corner of the quilt and offers it to your lap. It's heavy with memory, soft with years of careful stitching. You can feel the warmth in every square. You ask her if she'd ever consider keeping another. She pauses, smiles. I've thought about it, but they'd have big paws to fill. The wind whistles through the eaves. The stove flickers. Somewhere outside, a carriage rattles past, but here in this room of careful objects and remembered whiskers, time sits gently. No rush, no forgetting. Mrs. Finch places one last bow in your hands. It's unmarked. For yours, she says. When the time comes, you don't need to speak. You simply hold it the weight, light as breath, and imagine the first crumb you'll place inside. The morning is pale and quiet, and the light filtering through the window is soft enough to make the dust look like mist. You're back in a room that could be anywhere. Really, a familiar parlor, a borrowed guest room, or perhaps just the shape of memory, taking its final form. You sit beside a small wooden writing desk. On it, a ribbon, a spool of thread, and an empty patch of velvet, no bigger than a folded handkerchief. It once lined a pocket. You run your fingers over the worn fabric, remembering what it held. There are no mice in the room now, not in sleeves or skirts, not curled in teacups or thimbles, but you feel them anyway. Their presence lingers like the echo of a laugh or the scent of sugar dust on fingertips. You open a drawer and find a folded scrap of paper. On it, scrawled in ink that's just beginning to fade, are the words, "Keep her warm. She doesn't like drafts." You smile. The age of the pocket mouse may be over, but the marks it left remain. In poems, pinned to dress hems, in embroidery tucked inside quilt linings, in old biscuit tins stored in closets, hiding just one more ribbon. Their stories, once stitched into seams and whispered over tea, now live in the people who remember, and in you. You close the drawer and return to the chair. Outside, the wind stirs the trees. Inside, a candle burns low, the wax curled at its base like a sleeping tail. You think about every lady you met, every name, every paw print, every mouse-sized spoon or staircase. Each of them carried something through their lives, a weight no larger than a plum pit, a heartbeat that fit in one hand. And still, they brought joy and surprise and quiet companionship where none was expected. Historians can debate the accuracy, the records, the realism. Let them. You were there. You remember Gertrude's ribbon, Ernest in the pocket of a marching coat, Matilda's burial beneath the lavender, Pip's pirouette on a biscuit tin. You remember softness in a stiff-collared world as you sit in that final hush, the velvet still warm from your palm. You realize something lovely. Even the tiniest companion can change the shape of your life. So if one day you feel something stirring in your coat hem, don't be alarmed. Reach gently. You never know what love might be curled there waiting. And now the mice are asleep. The house is dark, the kettle long cooled, and the fire reduced to soft embers under ash. There are no more biscuit crumbs, no rustling in coat linings, no ribboned creatures peeking out from under lace. Only you remain in the warmth of stillness. Let yourself settle now. Let the breath come slower, the thoughts stretch longer between each other. Imagine your own quiet corner. Maybe it's a velvet pouch in a wool-lined pocket, or a matchbox tucked in the crook of a bookcase, or a cushion beside a window where the moonlight pools just so. Wherever it is, you're safe there, curled up with your memories, your laughter, and your softness. Feel the comfort of small things, the scratch of thread beneath fingers, the weight of a mouse too small to burden, but just big enough to soothe. Let go of the grand. Rest in the gentle. You've carried many things today. Now it's time to be carried. Close your eyes. The parlor is quiet. The garden is still. The stories have been told. And the smallest heart you've ever held is sleeping.